I'm finally going to make a wooden cutting board. This is probably one of the most requested projects that I've gotten, or the project that people wonder why I haven't done yet. So I've had this idea to make a pizza cutting board that looks like a pizza. I think it'd be fun to make the pattern of a pepperoni pizza into a cutting board. So I got a piece of yellow heart and I cut that into shorter sections of about 20 inches. So I have the yellow heart for the cheese, some cherry for the crust, and a piece of padauk for the pepperoni. Now I can cut up the cherry. Now the cherry's a little more warped, so it's going to need a little bit more surfacing. So I can run it through the joiner, and I can also run the yellow heart through the joiner. And I can run both of them through the planer, and this will give me a piece that's the same thickness all the way across, and will be good for making segments for the cutting board. Now I can angle the blade, and what I'm going to do is make a big wedge out of the yellow heart. And from that wedge I can cut triangular pieces to make the shape for the cutting board. So it's sort of like I'm making pieces of pizza. So what I'll do is cut a 15-degree angle off of each side of my pieces of yellow heart. Then I can cut the 15-degree angle into the other side of each of the pieces, which will vary in width. So I'm making a bunch of trapezoids, I believe. I can cut the other side. These are all my strips, and those can be stacked up to make the wedge shape. Now I can glue all these together, and I didn't want to glue them all at once, as I'd have all of those seams sliding around, and trying to keep them stacked together and aligned would be difficult. So I glued one seam at a time and would let that set up for a few minutes, then take the clamps off and glue another seam and sort of build the wedge up out of that process. And it didn't take too long. So with my wedge made, I wanted to flatten the two big surfaces a little bit. I knew I was probably going to have to do some shaping of the angle and the sides once they were cut. So I didn't want to take off too much at this point. But it would be easier to hold on the table saw and a little safer if I flattened that surface. So I cleaned up the end and I set my stop. What I decided on was 1.5 inches minus the thickness of the blade, and I would cut my pieces of pizza. So it's sort of like cutting pieces of pizza from a sausage instead of from a circle. So once I had them all cut, I laid them out in a circle, and of course the angle wasn't exactly perfect. So I needed to take a little bit off of the angle on each of the triangles. So I would hold each one against the disc sander and push a little bit more on the narrow end of the triangle. And doing this on all of the triangles added up to getting rid of the discrepancy in the ring. And with some fine tuning, I got it to fit perfectly. Now, in doing this, my centers weren't really aligning that well, so I decided to sand off the very point of the triangle. And I would hide the hole in the center with the piece of pepperoni. Now I can glue all of the cheese together. And this is just gluing up a ring. And I used a hose clamp to clamp everything together. Now I can work on the crust, and I can cut that same 15-degree angle into the sides of the cherry. Now I wanted this ring to overlap the outside diameter of the cheese ring. So I wanted these to be a little bit shorter than that outside diameter for each segment. And I ended up making them a little bit too long, so I shortened them on my segment cutting sled. And then they were just about right. So I glued the cherry into a ring. And I didn't have a hose clamp set up that was big enough, so I just used my band clamp, and that worked just as well. Now I attached some scrap pieces to the outside of the cherry ring, and I will use those to help hold the ring down to the CNC table. Now I wanted to know where the ring was, both sort of in its rotation and its location, both in the computer and my drawing and on the table and where it was being cut, because I was going to have to do some precise aligning. So I found the center and I made that my 0 point. And that allowed me to trim out the inside seam on the cherry. I've been doing with my 2D cuts both a roughing and a finishing pass when I'm trying to match two pieces together. Now I traced out and marked where this cherry piece was on the table. And in doing that, I could put the cheese piece in the same location and have it cut that seam around the outside of the cheese in just the right place. Now with the cheese piece, I can just screw it straight down to the table because I can hide the screw holes with pieces of pepperoni. I did a light test cut to make sure I was going to be in the right place with this seam cut. And then I cut the seam around the cheese. I tested to see whether the crust would fit, and I knew it was going to be a little bit too big at that point. So I went back and did finishing passes on the cheese, getting closer and closer to a fit that would work, taking off just a couple of thousandths of an inch each time. And I finally got to where that seam seemed like it was going to work, so I could glue it together. When I first started to think about this, I was thinking the seam between the crust and the cheese would just be another straight line, and it would just go from one type of wood to another type of wood. But then I was thinking that edge should be sort of a curvy, random line, sort of like melted cheese. I was thinking I was going to have to do this for each piece, and I would do them separately and then glue the whole thing together into a ring. But what I came up with was to do the cheese as a complete circle and the crust as a complete circle, and then just make one big long seam all the way around both of them. The next thing to do is to lay out the pepperoni. I took a photo of the cheese and crust and slipped it in under my drawing of the cutting board. And this allowed me to lay out the pepperoni in a way that I would have a pepperoni slice over the 3 screw holes in the cheese and the center, basically covering the defects in the cheese and the crust. Then I could cut the holes for the pepperoni in one pass. So I put the piece back in the same screw holes as it was before, and I checked and checked to make sure that my pepperonis were going to cover the defects in the cheese that I needed it to. Then I could cut all of those holes at once, and this part went pretty fast. Now to make the pepperoni, I mounted the piece of padauk vertically in the CNC table, and I could make a dowel in the end of that piece that will fit in the holes that I made in the cheese perfectly. So I did a step roughing cut and then a final finishing pass around the whole piece. And I would do that and take it out and then walk the piece over to the radial arm saw And I had a stop set up to cut off a 1/2 inch off of that cylinder. So I could get 2 pieces of pepperoni for each one of these cycles. And I think I needed 22 in total. So I had to do that process 11 times. Something I tried this time was to drill a really small hole in the bottom of the holes for the pepperoni so that air doesn't get trapped under the piece that's being put into the hole. And that really seemed to help. Then it was just a matter of putting glue in the hole and putting the pepperoni in place. And it doesn't need any clamping or anything, just held in with its own friction. I started out doing one at a time, and I figured out pretty quickly that I could do 3 or 4 at a time. And I tried sanding the bottom on the drum sander, and it did help. Cutting end grain on hardwood is pretty difficult with this drum sander. It doesn't take off a whole lot. Then I could do a surfacing pass on the top of the cutting board, and that made everything flush. Then I could cut out the circle of the cutting board and cut it free of my little hold down blocks. Now I put in a whole bunch of bridges between the hold down blocks and the cutting board, but they left little bumps on the outside of the cutting board. So I flush trimmed those by putting a flush trimming bit in the CNC spindle. And I put a really small roundover bit in the CNC spindle and rounded over the top edge of the cutting board. Then I tried sanding the top surface, as there were still shallow tool marks from the CNC machine. And this helped, but it wasn't getting everything. So I went over it with a hand sander. And this took quite a while, maybe 20 minutes of slowly going over it and going through the finer and finer sandpapers. It did work, it just took some effort. Now I can put finish on, and I put a quick coat on the bottom and then a thicker coat on the top. Now I really like the design or the pattern of the cutting board, but the wood colors didn't come out quite as well as I'd hoped. The yellow heart from the side, if you're looking at the side grain of yellow heart, it looks really yellow. But if you're looking at the end grain, it's more just sort of brown. And it's not that different from the cherry. I was hoping there'd be more difference between the cheese and the crust. And then with the finish, the padauk pepperoni is really dark, which is fine, but you don't really get the sense that it's a red or an orange kind of pepperoni color. Now, I had to make pizza and test it out. So my method of pizza making is to put my ceramic pizza stone on the top rack of the oven, then blast it with the broiler of the oven and get it nice and hot. Then put the pizza on the stone for about 4 minutes. And after 4 minutes, it's done. And you really have to be careful not to put it in for very much longer or it'll burn. The cutting board works really well. And it's big enough. I made it 16 inches in diameter, exactly. And we got a bigger diameter pizza cutter, which is nice too. When we were done, I was able to just wipe it off and it cleaned up really easily. So it works really well. It's a little bit over the edge of the kitsch or the camp kind of look that I usually want to do, but it was a really fun project. In fact, you could say maybe it's even a little bit cheesy. Thanks for watching.